General Gnaeus Julius Agricola stood on the wet heather at the very edge of humanity. It was beginning to rain, and a misty drizzle was being carried inland on the saline air. This truly was a savage place, a place where the gods had not worked their benevolence, as they had on his Mediterranean home. He looked out across the deep waters of the outer edge of the known world. The campaign was over, but Agricola had one last command to undertake. After 4 decades of sporadic conquest and numerous setbacks, the Roman army was poised to finally enter the highlands of northern Caledonia, to wipe out the remaining native resistance and determine the limits of Europe. Agricola would go on to confirm that the British land mass was an island by navigating unfamiliar seas, exploring undiscovered coastlines, and making contact with previously unknown peoples. Calgacus, the leader of the local barbarians, the one they called the swordsman, had said that beyond these shores lay only rocks and sea. That was probably true, but as he watched, the rain clouds rolled back over the northwestern sunset. Agricola wondered. He cast his mind back 30 years to when Claudius had just begun his conquest of Britain. Agricola had been a student in Massalia, ancient Marseille, a Greek-founded city. Under Roman rule, it was a respected center of learning with a prominent statue of the legendary Greek seafarer Pythias. For centuries earlier, in the time of Alexander the Great, Pythias had entered the Atlantic and explored the furthest limits of the ocean. Beyond Britain, he had claimed to have seen a further great landmass positioned far to the north. It was his belief that 3 vast islands formed the North Atlantic Isles, Britain, Ireland, and Thule. Pythias states that he set foot on every part of Britain. He also gives an account of Thule and describes a region where he says the land, sea, and air are no longer separate elements. Instead, there's a thick compound resembling a sea-lung jellyfish which suspends itself over the ocean and land, merging and binding elemental matter. This material cannot be traveled over or sailed through. In the long half-light before the first stars appeared, Agricola looked out at the darkening horizon. Was the legendary island of Ultima Thule out there at the very rim of the globe where daylight lingered? And so he mused to himself, if he had come this far, why not go further? Beneath him the Roman fleet had reassembled in a deep inlet to shelter from a sudden autumn storm. The war galleys and support vessels were making ready to range northward, supporting the legions who were pushing forward into the highlands and forests. Agricola watched as the ships shifted on an incoming tide. He would have told his fleet commander what to expect out there. Roman knowledge of the North Sea suggested that latitudes beyond Britain would be subject to frozen currents and biting cold winds from the far north. And beyond Britain the sea became cold and began to solidify. This process began with platelets of floating sea ice that resembled a shoal of encroaching jellyfish. But as the cold increased, these ice plates merged into sheets that could immobilize, then crush timber vessels. Agricola had seen with his own eyes the white mass of a Caledonian sea mist hang over an early frost, truly a compound resembling a sea lung, as Pythias had claimed some 4 centuries prior. And so, were the Roman military about to encounter Ultima Thule? Would the explorers sent out by Agricola soon tread the beaches of this remote, mysterious, and semi-mythical land? But of course this was not the first time the Romans had explored beyond the limits of the known world or across the boundaries of knowledge. A long sequence of adventure, conquest, and ambition had led Rome and its armies far beyond the familiar to the boundaries of the unknown. Centuries of expansion had pushed the eternal city to the ends of the earth, not only to the far north, but far east, west, and south, too. And so this is that story. This is the story of the edges of the empire. The Roman soldiers' diet was mainly wheat. Some sources tell us that salt was so prized that soldiers in the Republic were paid in salt, and this was the root of the word salary. This video has been sponsored by Factor, the best, healthiest meal delivery service out there, and something that those legionaries would have probably appreciated. Personally, Factor is great for saving me from my terrible vice of unhealthy takeaway food. Their healthy menus are updated weekly and include 27-plus meals and 33-plus add-on options. You can choose your favorite meals or let Factor craft your order based on your taste preferences and meal history. They offer keto, calorie smart, chef's choice, and vegan plus veggie options. It is an amazing time saver, and meal plans range from 4 to 18 meals per week, so you can add more or reduce the number depending on your specific needs. You can even skip a week if you need to. So head to factor75.com or click the link below and use code VOICE50 to get 50% off your first Factor box. Thanks to Factor for supporting history. Content on YouTube. In the 3rd century BC, the embattled Roman state was largely confined to Italy with a powerful network of Italian city-state allies. But in the century that followed, proud legions captured and subdued Macedonia, seized the prosperous island of Sicily, and laid claim to territories in western Spain. Finally, after generations of persistent rivalry and warfare, they closed in on the already beaten and beleaguered Carthaginians on the coast of North Africa. Following a 3-year siege, the monumental conflict between these two opposing empires was at last concluded. The Roman general Scipio Aemilianus oversaw the final brutal capture and destruction of the seaport of Carthage. He gave orders that the Roman army should burn, destroy, and demolish everything in their path. During 6 days of savage fighting in the city streets, the order was repeatedly given to clear the thoroughfares. The wounded and dying citizens were dragged away and heaped along with corpses and debris from collapsing buildings. Then both living and dead bodies were cast into pits filled with rubble and other charred remains. Appian writes, to make the streets passable, they cleared the debris with axes, mattocks, and pronged tools. With these iron instruments, the dead and the living were rolled and dragged along like debris before being hurled together into pits. The trenches were filled with the dead and still living. Finally, over 50,000 traumatized survivors who had taken refuge in an inner citadel surrendered. They were secured in the iron chains of the Roman slave dealers. One, surrounded by his closest advisors, Scipio, oversaw this final destruction of the city from a distant vantage point. As the ruins of Carthage smoldered down to embers and ashes, Scipio is said to have suddenly stood very still in quiet reflection. The battle was over. The threat of death was gone and the thrill of killing had subsided. He became lost in thought. Was this the ultimate destiny of all empires? Appian records. Scipio beheld the final destruction of a city which had flourished 700 years from its foundation. It had ruled over so many lands, islands, and seas. It had been prosperous with great armies and fleets, elephants, and wealth of money. It had been equal to the mightiest monarchies, but surpassed them all in bravery and ambition. Now the city had met its end in a final and complete destruction. Scipio, beholding the spectacle, is said to have shed tears and publicly lamented the destiny of his enemy. A Greek advisor called Polybius, who was standing nearby, overheard Scipio mutter a quote from Homer, a verse from the Iliad concerning the destruction of the legendary city of Troy. The great campaign was over, but what next? Perhaps, thought Polybius, a new odyssey was about to begin. He turned his back on the broken city and looked out towards a sea where new possibilities awaited. Could he become a new Odysseus? Rome was victorious, Carthage was gone, and its possessions in North Africa were now the property of the expanding Roman Empire. The sea lanes leading into the Atlantic were suddenly open to Roman shipping. But what unknown lands lay beyond the Mediterranean and the fabled Pillars of Hercules? Scipio was determined to destroy all remnants of Carthage, and this included its diaspora. The Carthaginians had established small colonies and trade stations on the arid outer shores of North Africa, modern-day Morocco, had these Atlantic connections provided the Carthaginians with their great wealth and good fortune? Perhaps. So Scipio offered his Greek advisor Polybius command of several Roman war galleys and instructed him to find the westward limits of Carthaginian power. And so his journey west began. By following the African coast, Polybius passed the high Atlas mountain range and prepared to enter the Atlantic. But he was crossing through more than a physical limitation. He was intruding into the domain of gods. Myths, heroes, and monsters. Deities always existed where practical experience faltered and common knowledge ended. As they passed into uncharted regions, Polybius and his small fleet, like Odysseus, prepared themselves for supernatural hazards as well as physical dangers. To begin with, it was said that the world-bearing Titan Atlas held the weight of the sky on his shoulders. Indeed, the fossilized remains of this godlike giant might yet be seen in the high Atlas mountains. Perhaps his massive form would be glimpsed as a vast mountain column projecting upwards, far beyond the tallest peaks. The Romans strained their eyes looking inland at the ranges to discern the shape or form of the primordial Titan. At the edge of the Mediterranean, a high, cliff-like promontory hove into view on the European coast. This was the Rock of Gibraltar, which formed one flank of the legendary Pillars of Hercules, the gateway between the Mediterranean and the Atlantic. It was said that the legendary demigod Hercules had cut a channel through a mountain to join the seas and enter the Atlantic, though other accounts suggested Hercules had merely fortified an existing sea passage so that giant oceanic monsters might not stray into the peaceful Mediterranean. This rock-hewn passage was a straight through, which Polybius and his ships now passed. As he passed this legendary spot, Polybius must have considered the reports of his Greek forebears, who had themselves heard second-hand accounts from Carthaginian seafarers. For it had been in the 6th century BC that a Carthaginian commander named Hanno the Navigator had voyaged beyond the Pillars of Hercules and explored the western seaboard of the African continent. Hanno had left an account of his voyage. This had been translated into Greek and circulated among Roman authorities in an abbreviated form. It was said that Hanno had commanded a settler fleet intended to colonize distant regions. But south of Morocco, the Carthaginians had encountered only a bleak and hostile coastline. The Greek writer Arrian read the translated report. As Hanno sailed south, he encountered crippling obstacles, a lack of water, scorching heat, and streams of lava gushing into the sea. Perhaps these explorers had sailed beyond the southern limit of the vast Saharan desert and witnessed volcanic lava spilling into the sea at Mount Cameroon. More terrifying were the human-like creatures encountered in the region. Hanno had reported, in this lagoon was another island full of savages. Most of them were women with hairy bodies, whom our interpreters called gorillas. Although we chased them, we could not catch any males. They all escaped, since they were good climbers, and could defend themselves with stones. However, we caught 3 women. They refused to follow those who carried them off, biting and clawing at them. So we killed them and flayed them and brought their skins back to Carthage. We could not sail any further because our provisions were running short. These pelt-like skins had been taken to Carthage and hung as curiosities in the temple of the goddess Tanit, macabre trophies lingering on as a testament to a strange, never-to-be repeated voyage. For almost 4 centuries the hides hung silently in the shrine until the destruction of Carthage, when the Romans looted the city and burned the sacred temple. By contrast, the temperate shores of Western Europe were explored by Carthaginian merchants, who sailed to distant northern islands in pursuit of valuable resources. Somewhere out in the Atlantic Ocean were trade routes to the distant Isle of Albion, Britain, and Urney, Ireland. the Celtic peoples of southern Britain supplied. Essential tin, which was alloyed with commonly found copper to produce sturdy, alluring bronze. Metal, other strange materials reached the Mediterranean through these Atlantic sea lanes, including valuable Baltic amber. This was thought to be the congealed rays of the setting sun. Sometimes strange tropical insects could be seen in the solidified center of this highly desirable substance. Perhaps they were evidence of an undiscovered tropical zone in the faraway frozen north, and so it was that after the destruction of Carthage, Scipio sent out a small exploratory Roman fleet commanded by Polybius. Passing cautiously through the Pillars of Hercules, they sailed south around the coast of Morocco. The Roman writer Pliny the Elder records, after sailing round the coast, Polybius reported that in a westerly direction beyond Mount Atlas, there are forests teeming with the wild animals that Africa produces. Beyond this is the river Nan, which is full of crocodiles and hippopotami. From the Nan there is a line of mountains, going right up to a high peak that the Greeks call the Chariot of the Gods. With their greatest rival, Carthage, removed from power, the Romans had finally reached the western gateway of the Mediterranean and entered the Atlantic Ocean. The coastal ports of western Gaul now within their reach, a new direction for exploration, contact, and conquest had been revealed. The routes of Roman fortune were now opened into the west. But this was just the beginning. In another region of the ancient world, another leading general of the Roman Republic was also suddenly overcome by emotion at his very moment of supreme victory. Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus, Pompey the Great, stood in shock as he was presented with the semi-embalmed corpse of his royal enemy Mithridates. Those given the task of preserving the royal remains had failed to remove the brain tissue, and the putrid object set before him filled Pompey with a deep revulsion. Nevertheless, one of the greatest foes the Romans have ever faced was dead. Pompey's grand campaign for vengeance, exploration, and conquest was over. The year was 65 BC, and yet another great kingdom had fallen to the rising power of Rome and its relentless legions. The Pontic king Mithridates VI, Eupator, had been betrayed by his allies and subjects in the Crimean kingdom of the Cimmerian Bosporus. This had been his last refuge, and the king had ended his own life rather than suffer humiliation as a captive in Rome. In his pursuit of Mithridates, Pompey the Great had entered the Caucasus Mountains, passed through the dark forests of Caucasus, and explored the snow-capped mountains between the turbulent Black Sea and the mysterious Caspian region. Now that the archenemy of Rome was dead, the general reflected on the extraordinary discoveries he had made in these far eastern territories. The heavily forested territory of Caucasus on the west coast of the Black Sea had always been a dangerous and largely unknown region, a wilderness zone where tall, dense forests fringed mountain ranges. Near where the Rione River emptied into the Black Sea was an ancient Greek harbor town named Phasis, a frontier trading outpost that retained its wild and dangerous character throughout antiquity. Statues of classical gods stood in the harbor, and town center displaying the strange influence of barbaric local cults. The site was a hub for numerous merchants and fugitives who mingled with guides, translators, and dubious representatives from the nearby mountain tribes. And so it was Phasis that had served as the outer limit of the furthest Greek voyages. Indeed, not even Alexander the Great had dared to enter this region. This meant Caucasus was a subject of long-standing myth and legend, once again a region thought to encroach on the realm of the gods. Many in Rome must have wondered what had Pompey found out there at the limits of the known world. Greek myth had long warned of the dangers of exceeding human knowledge contrary to the will of the gods. It was said that the Titan Prometheus had fashioned mankind from clay, giving his creation thought and reason, but this primeval deity had suffered eternal punishment for giving his prodigies the key to technology and understanding of fire. On the orders of Zeus, Prometheus had supposedly been chained to a rock in the furthest reaches of the Caucasus Mountains. Bound on a high mountain peak, a giant eagle would descend each day to tear out the innards of the helpless immortal. Ancient Caucasus was too immortalized in the story of Jason and the Argonauts who sought the golden fleece in this forbidding region. Accounts of gold dust and giant dragon serpents filled the minds of Greek writers regarding these unexplored mountains. The main anchor from Jason's ship, the Argo, was on display in the center of Phasis as a monument to the ancient myth. Some visitors doubted the authenticity of this object since it was made of relatively unweathered iron, but their skeptics were shown fragments of an older stone object that better fitted the antiquity of the myth. And so this was the place where King Mithridates had fled to rally his tribal allies against Rome, and this was where Pompey had to follow to defeat this great enemy. But Pompey was also eager to lead his soldiers into a land of myth and legend. According to Appian, Pompey wanted to gain knowledge of the country visited by the Argonauts, Castor and Pollux, and Heracles. He especially desired to see the place where they say that Prometheus was fastened to Mount Caucasus. From the Pontic kingdom, Pompey marched on and invaded the small kingdom of Caucasian Iberia. Caucasus was now cut off from Armenia and Iran, but Pompey did not push onwards to the coast of the mysterious Caspian Sea. Instead, he headed inland to find the Rioni River and capture the city port of Phasis. This connected him with the Roman fleet operating in the Black Sea. But once more he discovered that Mithridates had fled. Pompey thought of pursuing the fugitive with the Roman fleet and sailing past Mount Strobios, where Prometheus had been chained by Zeus. Would a Roman general dare look upon the sight where the creator of mankind had withstood his eternal punishment? But suddenly, a new plan entered the mind of Pompey. He realized that he would only retain his command while Mithridates remained a threat to Rome. While the defeated king was confined to the far north, the Near East was exposed to immediate Roman conquest. Plutarch reports, Pompey was seized by a great and eager passion to claim Syria and march through Arabia to the Red Sea. His victorious career would therefore touch the ocean which surrounds the world on all sides, for in Africa he had been the first to conquer as far as the outer sea, and in Spain he had made the Atlantic Ocean the western boundary of the Roman domains. In his recent pursuit of the Albany, he had narrowly missed reaching the Caspian Sea. So now Pompey put his army in motion, determined to reach the Red Sea and complete the circuit of his military expeditions. Pompey marched south with his legions, seizing Syria and making the kingdom of Judea subject to the Roman Empire. In Jerusalem, Pompey and his entourage entered the great temple of the one true God of the Jews. They ignored all appeals and threats by the priests and defied the holy law by gazing upon the artifacts of the Lord. As his men held back the protesting high priest, Pompey inhaled the heavy scent of hallowed incense and stepped forward to vanish behind the veil that covered the darkness of the inner sanctuary. His soldiers waited for the general to reappear with the idol of the Lord God Almighty of the Jews. Would he smash it before the distraught priests, or carry it back to be mocked in a great triumphal procession through the streets of Rome? Time passed, but he did not immediately reappear. Josephus records that Pompey had simply examined the artifacts preserved in that holy place, but removed nothing. He reappeared empty-handed, and then departed in silence. But Pompey continued the march south. The Nabatean kingdom in northwest Arabia was next to submit to Rome, and the legions were encamped near the rock-cut city of Petra. All the threats of divine curses and catastrophes had proven false, and the Near East was now under imperial control. The region belonged to Rome, and the outer sea was within their grasp. But the campaign led by Pompey had far exceeded its objectives. This was irrefutable when news reached him that Mithridates was already dead. There had been an uprising in the Cimmerian Bosporus, and the king had ended his life as a final escape from pursuits of the Romans. The war was done. Pompey received the messengers and was presented with the semi-embalmed corpse of Mithridates. But the general chose not to look upon the putrid remains or reflect upon this man's great fall from regal power and glory, for it was now he realized that the exploratory aspect of his mission must also cease. Pompey had failed to encounter any monsters or meet any living divinities in the distant Caucasus, but at Phasis, the Romans did find Indian commodities among the goods trafficked overland from the Caspian Sea. These Indian goods came from Bactria, Afghanistan, via the Oxus River to the Caspian coasts. Pompey had discovered a possible route to India that could bypass Iran and the rival Parthian Empire, but who amongst ordinary merchants and travelers would dare traverse this route through distant and dangerous lands? Not Pompey. 15 years later, he finally met his fate in the East. Defeated by Julius Caesar in the Roman civil wars, the dejected general was betrayed by his own officers and murdered. When his severed head was presented to Caesar, the dictator too turned away in disgust and horror. Despite the political conflict, Caesar mourned the loss of his former friend and colleague. From that moment on, it would be Caesar and his dynasty who would decide the fate and further expansion of the Roman Empire. Eudaimon, Arabia, in ancient Yemen, had been the main harbor of mysterious Sabaeans, but now the harbor buildings were engulfed in flames, sending high columns of acrid smoke ascending into the sky. For Eudaimon, Arabia had been the victim of a Roman raid designed to test the logistics and feasibility of a maritime campaign route that could reach outer Arabia. It was the prelude to war, planned as a precursor to a larger invasion of southern Arabia led by the Roman commander Aelius Gallus. The attack was ordered by Augustus, the successor to Julius Caesar and the first true emperor of Rome. But what great prize or knowledge had brought Roman conquest of this distant region? The answer could be found in the acrid stench that was streaming from the harbor and rising up into the darkening sky like some perverse sacrifice to the gods of war. Incense. Arabian incense was sacred to many ancient cultures, whether you were Roman, Greek, Jew, or Persian. When the pungent smoke released from burning desiccated tree saps ascended skyward, it carried holy fragrances towards the heavens. Indeed, incense was a much more appealing offering to the many gods and the odor of animal sacrifice, but it was not easy to obtain. Arabia was a remote land of extreme deserts, and the stunted trees that produced this sap grew only on its southern coasts. The cliffs and promontories of the seaboard were difficult to approach from the coast, and the region was seldom entered by outsiders, and so the hardened drops of sap produced by lacerating the wiry incense trees were sent inland through desert trails to reach distant trade stations near the Mediterranean or the Persian Gulf. These incense trails cross 1,000 miles through restricted caravan routes where Arabian merchants carried their precious loads on heavily burdened camel teams. Incense was so valuable that even small pouches of this alluring substance could only be purchased using multiple pouches of gold and silver. Coins. Early accounts of the biblical King Solomon describe how he received an incense caravan from the Queen of Sheba. The Book of Kings contains a verse, "And Sheba came to Jerusalem with a very great caravan, with camels that bore incense, and very much gold and precious stones. And when she was come to Solomon, she communed with him concerning all that was in her heart." Indeed, in 332 BC, Alexander the Great acquired vast stocks of Arabian incense when he captured the Phoenician city of Tyre on the Syrian seaboard. A decade later, with his Persian conquests complete, Alexander had planned to seize southern Arabia by launching a fleet from the Persian Gulf, but his sudden, unexplained death in Babylon had ended the invasion plans. 3 centuries would pass before another great ruler would attempt the conquest, and so it was 25 BC when the Emperor Augustus planned to surpass Alexander and add Arabia to the Roman domains, although this was an economic decision as much as anything else. 5 years earlier, when Egypt became an imperial province, there had been a boom in consumer spending across the empire when vast wealth was released from the Ptolemaic royal treasuries to be awarded to Roman citizens. Augustus understood that large quantities of Roman gold and silver were passing into the hands of Arab merchants through the incense, traffic, and trade. This was an outpouring of finite imperial bullion to acquire a renewable resource. Why, then, shouldn't the Romans possess this region and control the substance that was most sacred to their gods